Welcome back to Creepshow, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of true crime. Today we're exploring a chilling topic, some of the world's most notorious killers who met a gruesome fate themselves, not at the hands of the law, but by fellow inmates within the prison system. These infamous figures, once feared on the outside, became targets in the violent underworld behind bars. Buckle up, because this is one countdown that will leave you questioning justice, revenge, and the brutal reality of life behind bars. Number 10. Jeffrey Dahmer. When the fragmentary remains of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, including a severed head that was found in the refrigerator, were discovered in his apartment, he became known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. Over the course of the years, 1978 to 1991, he murdered, dismembered, and cannibalized 17 people. When an individual who was supposed to be Dahmer's victim managed to flee the building and report it to the authorities, Dahmer was finally apprehended. Because of his sick and perverted sense of humor, Dahmer was not able to make any friends in the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where he was serving his sentence of life in prison. It was well known that Dahmer would play with his food, such as by molding his supper to look like severed limbs and coloring his blood with ketchup. Some people who are in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them. Christopher Schaefer, a fellow inmate, remembers saying about him, "The 28th of November, 1994, was the day when Schaefer finally had enough. During the time that he was left alone with Dahmer in a gymnasium, he used a metal bar that was 20 inches long and was a piece of gym equipment to murder the cannibal killer." Schaefer stated, "He began looking for the door in a relatively short amount of time. I was able to prevent him. A tragic end befell him. It was I who lowered his head. It was on the route to the hospital that Dahmer succumbed to his injuries and passed away. He was 32 years old." Number 9. James Whitey Bulger. In the year 2018, on October 30th, James Whitey Bulger, the most notorious criminal lord and murderer in the city of Boston, was put to death behind bars. Due to the fact that Whitey was a well-known informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he had a large number of adversaries. During the time that he was being transferred from the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma to Hazleton, West Virginia, he was serving a sentence for his involvement in 11 murders. Whitey was murdered a little over a dozen hours after the move took place. Whitey was 89 years old and confined to a wheelchair when his two assailants rolled him into a blind spot on the video cameras and beat him to death with a padlock that was stuffed inside of a sock. The assault was so severe that it caused his eyeballs to become dislocated, and officials at the prison described him as unrecognizable. During the time that he was serving a life sentence for the murder of the Genovese crime family head in 2003, Fotios Freddy Gias, a former mafia hitman, was considered to be one of the primary suspects in connection with the murder. I hate to be morbid, but knowing the way he was, it's probably a long time coming, seeing that he was responsible for so many other families and people's misery over the years, said a close friend of the Bulger family. It's probably been a long time coming. One of the oldest proverbs in the world states, "What goes around comes around." Number 8. Leroy Martin. Leroy Martin, also frequently referred to as the Gaffney Strangler, was a serial killer who operated in the United States during the late 1960s. At the end of the day, Martin was a family man who was married and a father to 3 sons. During the night, he would follow women and teenage girls down routes that were not easily accessible. He would then force them into his vehicle and then strangle and kill them. Additionally, he indulged in necrophilia with the bodies of the 4 victims, which were discarded in wooded locations following the murders. When Martin arrived at the funeral of Nancy Reinhardt, who had been murdered, he stood over her open casket and said, "She sure is a pretty girl. I don't see how anybody could have done this to her." Nancy Reinhardt had been 14 years old at the time of her death. Following the discovery of his vehicle at the site of a crime, he was ultimately taken into custody. After some time had passed, he made a statement regarding his criminal activities, stating, "Sometimes there just ain't no news, and people have to do things to make news." Kenneth Rumsey, a fellow inmate at Central Correctional Institution in South Carolina, was the one who stabbed him to death within the confines of the facility in the year 1972. Later on, Rumsey committed suicide by hanging himself in his own cell. Number 7. Gerard John Schaefer. Gerard John Schaefer, who committed the murder, had previously served as a deputy sheriff in Martin County, Florida. He kidnapped 2 adolescent girls in 1972 and transported them to a lonely forest, where he threatened to either kill them or sell them as sex slaves. He also threatened to keep them as slaves. Due to the fact that he was called away on his police radio, the girls were able to take flight. In response to Schaefer's assertion that he had kidnapped the girls for the sole purpose of frightening them and preventing them from hitchhiking again, he was stripped of his police badge. After being released on bond, Schaefer went on to commit the murders of 2 additional teenage girls 2 months later. Moreover, he is suspected of being a serial killer. Schaefer attempted to file a lawsuit against Patrick Kendrick, a true crime journalist, for portraying him as an overweight, doughy, middle-aged man who preyed on victims who were psychologically and physiologically weaker than him. Schaefer was incarcerated at the time of the lawsuit. In the same manner, Schaefer was stabbed to death in his cell on December 3, 1995, by another convict named Vincent Rivera, who did not appear to have any obvious purpose for his actions. Within the context of the life sentence that Schaefer was already serving for double murder, he was given an additional 53 years of imprisonment. Number 6. Charles Schmid. The Pied Piper of Tucson was a sneering moniker that was given to Charles Schmid, a vicious serial killer of children. Since he was in his early 20s, Schmid has a reputation for dating underage females and for hanging out with a much younger crowd than his peers generally were. After luring the females in with his speedy automobiles, he would then prepare them for sexual encounters. From 1964 to 1965, he was responsible for the deaths of 3 high school girls. The bodies of 2 victims that Schmid had buried in the desert were eventually brought to the attention of the authorities by his best friend, Richard Bruns, who went to the authorities after Schmid had shown him the bodies of the victims. Schmid is the one who admitted to killing simply for the sake of experiencing what it was like to do it. He was often compared to Elvis Presley in terms of his physical appearance by the press. While incarcerated at Arizona State Prison on March 10, 1975, Schmid was murdered by 2 other convicts. His death occurred on that day. He was stabbed a total of 47 times by the convicts, and after suffering the loss of an eye and renal function, he ultimately succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Number 5. Richard Loeb. In 1924, Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold, who was Loeb's partner, shot and killed Bobby Franks, who was 14 years old. As the son of a prominent executive at Sears, Loeb was born into money, yet he later turned to stealing, vandalism, and arson as a means of funding his criminal activities. At the University of Chicago, when he was just 14 years old, he became acquainted with Leopold, and the 2 kid prodigies became fascinated with performing the perfect crime. With the intention of concealing Frank's identity, they first enticed him into a vehicle, then struck him over the head with a chisel, and last burned his face with acid. They disposed of his body by dumping it in a lake, and then sent a ransom note to the boy's father in an effort to distract him from the situation. On the other hand, Leopold was identified as the owner of a unique set of eyeglasses that were found at the scene of the crime. Even though they were spared the death penalty, Loeb was sentenced to another terrible end in the near future. James Day, a prisoner in Statesville Prison in Joliet, Illinois, was the one who brutally battered and killed him. Day stated that the murderer had made sexual attempts toward him. However, Leopold was released from prison in 1958 after having served a total of 33 years in prison. Number 4. Thor Christiansen. Women attending the University of California, Santa Barbara were the victims of serial killer Thor Christiansen, who committed his crimes during the years 1976 and 1977. Christiansen, who was born in Denmark, was a bright student who had a high IQ. However, he eventually quit high school and started working as a gas station attendant instead of continuing his education. After stealing a weapon from a buddy, Christiansen became obsessed with a scenario in which he would shoot women and then engage in necrophilia. This desire would eventually become a reality for him. Because of his prolific killing spree, he became known as the Mad Dane in later years. All of Christiansen's victims were very similar to one another, which led to the term look-alike killings being used to describe his killing spree. When his fifth intended victim managed to escape after being shot in the head, he was ultimately apprehended. After she had recovered from her injuries, she ran into him once more in a club in Los Angeles. After being stabbed in the exercise yard at Folsom State Prison on March 30th, 1981, Christiansen passed away as a result of his injuries. The identity of the person who ended up killing him is still a mystery. Number 3, Donald Harvey. An angel of death named Donald during his time working as an orderly in Ohio and Kentucky, Harvey admits to being responsible for the deaths of more than 80 hospital patients who were under his care. The number of victims is more likely to be between 40 and 57 patients, according to official reports. The serial murderer was active during the 1970s and 1980s, and he targeted primarily cardiac patients, suffocating them with pillows in an attempt to temporarily alleviate their suffering. The remaining victims were poisoned with arsenic and cyanide, and he also allowed the air in their tanks to run out during the process. Harvey was sentenced to the Toledo Correctional Institution in Toledo, Ohio, after entering a guilty plea in order to stave off the execution of the death penalty. On the 30th of March in 2017, Harvey was murdered by James Elliott, who was also incarcerated at the time. The newspaper known as The Blade got letters from Elliott in which he asserted that he had hit and stomped on Harvey while he was jailed. As a result of his upbringing in Kentucky, Elliott was familiar with the relatives of some of the victims who were slain by Harvey. Number 2, Leopold Dion. Upon his early release from jail, the Canadian serial killer Leopold Dion committed sexual assaults on 21 young men and took the lives of 4 more. The conviction for rape that Dion received in 1940 resulted in his receiving a sentence of life in prison. After being convicted of raping a kid who was 15 years old, he was granted release in 1956, but he was sent back to prison because of the conviction. Afterward, in 1963, a parole board gave him release once more, and he proceeded to commit the murders of 4 young boys. The public's outrage was a direct result of the sad events that took place. The executive director of the parole board, Benoit Godbout, stated that the board honestly believed, after examining many reports, that the man was ready and would probably do well on parole. Godbout was referring to the fact that the board had examined. A fellow prisoner by the name of Norman Champagne was responsible for Dion's death since he stabbed him on November 17, 1972. The inmate, who was referred to as Lawrence Darabee, Lawrence of Arabia, within the confines of the jail, was ultimately declared not guilty of this crime due to the fact that he was clinically insane. Number 1, Albert DeSalvo. Known as the Boston Strangler, he was responsible for the deaths of 13 female victims ranging in age from 19 to 85. He broke into their houses, assaulted them, and then strangled them to death, most of the time using their stockings. The individual known as the Green Man committed sexual assaults on more than 300 women and broke into more than 400 residences across the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. When he committed these acts, he was always dressed in green, which is what was responsible for earning him this nickname. Albert DeSalvo admitted that he was both the Boston Strangler and the Green Man, despite the fact that there was no physical evidence that demonstrated his involvement in the crimes. It was in 1967 when he was sent to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Cedar Junction, which is now known as Walpole High Security State Prison, to serve the remainder of his life sentence. DeSalvo was stabbed to death in his cell 7 years after he had been incarcerated for prison. Following that, in 2013, the authorities eventually stated that the DNA that was discovered on the body of a murder victim in the case of the Boston Strangler is a match to Albert DeSalvo that is 99.9% accurate. In order for DeSalvo to be physically linked to the murder, the family of the victim had to wait decades for DNA technology to evolve. According to Robert Hayes, the lead forensic scientist at the Boston Police Crime Lab, "I knew science would one day provide us with answers in this case." Thanks for tuning in to Creepshow. If today's video left you with chills, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more bone-chilling stories from the darkest depths of true crime. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Let us know in the comments what case you'd like us to cover next. And as always, stay safe, stay curious, and stay out of the shadows.